For a player who just signed a 6-year, $46.5 million contract, you would think the conversation around Matthew Knies would finally be over. Instead, it has only become louder. Over the past day, I've been hearing more discussion around Knies than almost any other Maple Leafs player, and what's interesting is that the conversation isn't really coming from Toronto, it's coming from around the league. Rival teams continue to ask the same question: is there any possible way to pry one of the NHL's most promising young power forwards away from the Maple Leafs? Here's what I'm hearing. Despite the growing trade speculation, there is still no indication that Toronto is actively shopping Matthew Knies. In fact, everything we know points in the opposite direction. The Maple Leafs just committed 6 years and $46.5 million to him because they view him as one of the cornerstones of their future. The latest reports connecting the Vancouver Canucks to Knies have generated plenty of attention, and I understand why. Vancouver has been looking to reshape parts of its roster, and league observers have pointed to Knies as the type of player every organization would love to build around. He's young, he's physical, he can score, and perhaps most importantly, he's still entering what should be the prime years of his career. But here's how I read this situation. There's a huge difference between another team wanting Matthew Knies and the Maple Leafs wanting to trade Matthew Knies. Those are two completely different conversations, and I think they've been mixed together over the last couple of days. From what has been reported, Vancouver's interest is exactly that interest. That's not unusual. Every front office keeps track of elite young players across the league. General managers make exploratory phone calls all the time. They ask questions. They test the market. Sometimes those conversations go nowhere within minutes. Other times they develop into something larger months later. That doesn't automatically mean Toronto has any intention of moving Knies. What makes this story fascinating is the timing. The Maple Leafs have spent years searching for exactly this kind of player. Big, skilled, physical, able to contribute offensively while bringing an edge that becomes even more valuable in playoff hockey. Those players don't become available very often, and when organizations finally develop one themselves, they usually do everything possible to keep him. That's exactly what Toronto appeared to do when they agreed to Knies' long-term extension. So naturally, people around the league started asking another question. If the Maple Leafs just committed to him financially, why do trade rumors continue to appear? My take is actually pretty simple. When a player becomes more valuable, trade speculation often increases rather than disappears. Think about it from another team's perspective. Knies now has cost certainty. Toronto knows exactly what his cap hit will be over the next 6 seasons. Other clubs know it too. If executives believe that contract could eventually become one of the better value deals in the league, of course they're going to wonder if there's any opportunity to acquire him before his value climbs even higher. That's not evidence that Toronto wants to move him. It's evidence that everyone else recognizes how valuable he has become. Another factor that keeps coming up is the lack of trade protection in his current contract. Since Knies does not immediately have a no-trade clause, technically he could be moved if Toronto ever decided to explore that option. I've seen some people point to that as proof that a deal could happen. Personally, I don't think that's enough. Having the ability to trade someone and actually wanting to trade someone are very different things. Every team has players without trade protection, but that doesn't mean they're available. In Knies' case, everything the organization has done publicly suggests they see him as part of the long-term core rather than someone they're preparing to move. That brings us to another important piece of the conversation. The Maple Leafs are still dealing with the expectations that follow every playoff disappointment. Whenever a team falls short, especially one with championship aspirations, speculation naturally increases during the offseason. Fans expect changes, analysts debate possible trades, rival executives wonder whether frustration could eventually lead to a blockbuster move, and that's simply how the NHL works. And because Knies is one of Toronto's most valuable trade assets, his name inevitably enters those discussions. Notice I said valuable trade asset, not likely trade candidate. There's an important distinction there. If Toronto ever decided to pursue a superstar in return, Knies would almost certainly be one of the first players opposing teams would request. That's because elite young talent is the hardest asset to acquire in today's NHL. Teams don't just give players like him away, they demand significant returns. The latest information I'm hearing continues to suggest that if another club wants Matthew Knies, the asking price would be enormous. We're not talking about a depth player and a draft pick. We're talking about the type of package that could reshape an organization. And honestly, that's exactly what it should take. Because when I look at Knies' trajectory, I don't just see what he is today. I see what he could become 3 or 4 years from now. Power forwards who can skate, finish around the net, handle physical play, and continue improving offensively often become some of the most valuable players in the entire league. Those aren't players you rush to trade away. Those are players you build around. which is exactly why this entire story has become so interesting. The more valuable Matthew Knies becomes to the Maple Leafs, the more aggressive other teams may become in trying to convince Toronto to reconsider. Whether those conversations ever move beyond simple interest is the question everyone around the league will continue watching closely. One thing I keep coming back to is how differently Toronto would have looked at Matthew Knies just 2 years ago compared to today. And back then, he was an exciting prospect with plenty of upside, but still a player who had to prove he could consistently impact games at the NHL level. Fast forward to now, and the conversation has completely changed. He's no longer viewed as someone with potential alone. He's viewed as someone who is already delivering on that potential while still having significant room to grow. That's why I believe some of the recent headlines have surprised fans. They read the words trade rumors next to Matthew Knies' name and immediately assume the Maple Leafs must be considering something dramatic. But here's how I interpret it. The better a young player becomes, the more phone calls a general manager receives. That's not unique to Toronto. Every contender experiences it. Rival teams identify players they wish they had, and they make inquiries. Most of those conversations never become serious negotiations. They simply help organizations understand whether a player's status has changed. From everything that's been reported, there is no evidence that Toronto has shifted its position on Knies. If anything, the long-term contract sends the opposite message. It tells the rest of the league that management believes he will be an important piece of this team for years to come. That brings us back to Vancouver. The Canucks have understandably been connected to players who fit their long-term vision. Knies checks nearly every box. He's young enough to grow with the core, he plays a physical brand of hockey that coaches love, and he has shown he can contribute in pressure situations. If you're building a roster capable of competing every spring, those are exactly the qualities you're searching for. The challenge, of course, is convincing Toronto to even consider moving him, and this is where my own opinion comes into play. If I'm running the Maple Leafs, I'm hanging up the phone unless the offer is overwhelming. Not good, not impressive, overwhelming. I'm talking about the kind of proposal that forces an organization to rethink everything. A package featuring established NHL talent, premium future assets, and players who immediately improve the roster. That's the level we're discussing when a 23-year-old power forward on a long-term contract enters trade conversations. Anything less simply doesn't make sense. The other factor that's easy to overlook is chemistry. Knies has developed alongside some of Toronto's biggest stars and has shown he can complement high-end offensive players while still bringing his own identity to the lineup. Every team searches for players who can produce without sacrificing physicality, and those combinations are surprisingly rare across today's NHL. That's another reason I believe Toronto views him differently than many outside observers. Sometimes fans evaluate a player strictly by goals and assists. Front offices usually see much more. They evaluate board battles, puck retrievals, defensive responsibility, net front presence, and how a player performs when games become tighter and more physical. Knies has earned praise in many of those areas, and that's part of what makes him such an attractive player around the league. There's also the salary cap element. When you look across the NHL, teams are constantly searching for players who can outperform their contracts. If Knies continues developing the way many expect, there's a legitimate chance that his annual cap hit could look even more team-friendly a few years from now. That's another reason rival executives would naturally explore whether there's any opening to acquire him before his value climbs even higher. But none of that changes the central fact of this story. Toronto appears to be in control. The Maple Leafs don't have to make a decision because they're under pressure. They don't have to move Knies to solve a contract dispute. They don't have to trade him because he wants out. None of those circumstances exist based on current reporting. Instead, they have a young player under contract for the long term, and other organizations are understandably interested. That's a position every general manager wants to be in. As this offseason continues, I expect Knies' name to remain part of league conversations simply because elite young players rarely escape speculation. Every fan base dreams about acquiring someone like him, and every rumor sparks another wave of debate online. That's the reality of today's NHL news cycle. Still, it's important to separate discussion from direction. Discussion is happening. Interest appears to be real. Speculation continues to grow, but direction is something entirely different. And right now, there has been no credible indication that the Maple Leafs are actively moving toward trading Matthew Knies. In fact, if anything, I think this entire situation reinforces just how highly he's valued. Teams don't spend time chasing players they don't believe can change their future. They target the ones they think can become franchise pieces, and that's exactly the category Knies is beginning to enter. So when I look at these latest reports, I don't see a player who's on his way out of Toronto. I see a player whose value has reached the point where other organizations can't stop asking about him.